Welcome, I'm Swick, and in this video we are going to talk about rhetoric and the rhetorical situation. In particular, this video is going to define what rhetoric is, explain the different components of any rhetorical situation, and discuss how writers, including yourself, address their rhetorical situation. So why don't we start with the basics? What even is rhetoric? Rhetoric is the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially that uses figures of speech and other compositional techniques to achieve a writer's purpose. In the simplest terms, rhetoric is effective writing. A rhetorical situation is any opportunity to achieve purpose through writing. Anything from a post-it note all the way to a doctoral dissertation has its own rhetorical situation. That's because they're all written with purpose, even though that purpose might vary in importance. So ever since the time of Aristotle, rhetoric has been carefully studied. And you might be wondering why. Well, the answer is simple. Understanding rhetoric means that we understand each other, that we understand messages. On a daily basis, you are bombarded with messages. And in the age of influencers and fake news, these messages can at times be manipulative. An effective reader can analyze a rhetorical situation to avoid any misinformation so that they always know the facts. And every rhetorical situation has distinct components. I use the acronym SPACES to help myself remember them. Let's go through them. First, there's the speaker, or in most cases, the writer, and that speaker has a purpose or what they're hoping to accomplish with their text. The audience is who the message is directed at or who is intended to carry out the purpose. The context includes everything surrounding the text, like the culture, the history, or the timing. Exigence, which is a very fancy word, is essentially the inspiration behind the text. What happened that moved the speaker to write anything? And finally, the subject, which is pretty simple. It's the topic. What are they talking about? So let's look at how all of these components interact using something called the rhetorical triangle. The rhetorical triangle illustrates how all the components of the rhetorical situation are connected and influence one another. For example, speaker, audience, subject, and context are all surrounding purpose. That's because if you change any one of those, it can alter the speaker's purpose. Let's give an example. Consider a college biology professor. If they are the speaker and their subject is photosynthesis, the purpose is going to change based on who that audience is. For instance, when they're speaking to their college students, they're probably preparing them for an exam or explaining the content to them so that they too know it. However, if that audience changes to a room full of kindergartners, that purpose is going to be very different. The professor is no longer preparing them for a test. Instead, the purpose might be to introduce them to the idea of photosynthesis, or it might just be to spark an interest in science. This illustrates how just changing one of the components of that rhetorical situation can alter the overall purpose. Here, let's look at another example with a very common text.
Let's complete a rhetorical triangle for the Declaration of Independence. First of all, the speaker was Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote the document, but really it was on behalf of the American colonists. And ultimately, the person who needed to receive the message, the audience, was King George or Britain. And as the topic might allude, the subject was independence. When completing a rhetorical triangle, it's easy to start with those three basics. Now, to think about context. First of all, it happened in 1776. We know that the colonists were frustrated over taxation, and they were essentially British controlled. That is the context that I have years and years after attending school. But from all these things, I need to determine the purpose. So, what did the colonists want? What were they trying to do in sending this document about independence to the British? Well, essentially, to announce their freedom or independence, I just don't have a lot of room, from British rule. Now, this one might seem easy because we know what the purpose of the Declaration of Independence was, I hope. But how I did that is I have who the British-controlled colonists are talking to their, I guess you could say their oppressors or the people that are controlling them, and they're frustrated about taxation. So clearly, they want to change. Their argument is about independence from that British control. So naturally, the purpose is to sever or to announce that that control no longer exists.
All right, time to practice. Take a second and copy down the rhetorical triangle into your notes. Then consider another famous rhetorical situation, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and complete the rhetorical triangle. To help you out, a link to the text has been attached in the description. So let's take a moment to stop and talk about where this skill will appear on your AP exam. Being able to understand and analyze a rhetorical situation is a core skill for AP Language and Composition, so it's going to appear throughout your exam. First, there will be multiple questions asking you to analyze the rhetorical situation. For instance, they might ask you to determine the purpose of a passage in a multiple choice style question. Second, you'll also have to demonstrate your ability to assess a rhetorical situation for each of the free response questions or the essay questions. Responding to these questions appropriately requires that you analyze the prompt for purpose and context so that you know you're writing on task. Finally, you're going to need to assess the rhetorical situation presented in question 2 of the free response questions, also known as the rhetorical analysis prompt. To determine the speaker's purpose and then analyze rhetorical choices they make, you need to have a firm understanding of the rhetorical situation as well as the purpose. So it looks like we better practice. In the next portion of this video, we will be using an anchor text to analyze the rhetorical situation. In this case, we're going to be using a statement made by Greta Thunberg, a climate change activist, before the United Nations. However, I can't play it in the video for copyright reasons. So pause this video, then in a new tab, use the links in the description to watch the video of her giving her statement or to read the transcript before we move on. Before we go any further, let's review what we've covered so far. In your notes, complete another rhetorical triangle, this time for Greta's statement to the UN. Pause the video and resume when you've completed the task. Did you finish? Let's go over what you wrote. Let's start with 3 points: speaker, audience, and subject. The speaker is, of course, Greta Thunberg, a climate change activist. She is speaking to members of the United Nations, and her topic is climate change. Pretty straightforward. From there, we look at context we can gather from the text. It occurred in 2019. She was speaking at a summit meant to take action against climate change. And finally, the ever-present threat of global warming is well known. These 3 factors make up part of the context. The next step is to determine her purpose. To do so, I considered how each of these components altered and shift her overall purpose. Before we move on, what do you think Thunberg's purpose is? This is a multiple choice question like you might see on your AP exam. Let's practice. Which of the following best describes Thunberg's purpose within her rhetorical situation? Is it to belittle the ethics of the United Nations, to promote her work as a young activist, to persuade leaders to take immediate action against climate change, to scold world leaders, or to rally young people to her environmental cause? Take a moment and determine which you think best describes her purpose. Explain your answer in your notes. The most accurate answer would be to persuade leaders to take immediate action against climate change. While there is a grain of truth to the other options, for example, she does scold them and she is promoting her work, her ultimate goal is for the United Nations to take action immediately and stronger, more aggressive action. While she may be frustrated, her goal is not to scold or belittle anyone. Her goal is to see change in policy. Now let's go a little bit deeper with some of the components of the rhetorical situation, starting with exigence and purpose. These are 2 that I've found students confuse and switch around often. So here's how I like to think about them. Exigence is the cause which inspires the speaker's desired effect. Exigence is the cause. Purpose is the effect that the writer wants to see. For instance, A journalist needs to write an article about a tornado that rips through a small town. The exigence is the tornado itself. That's what made any story, any text relevant and worth telling. The purpose is going to vary by the other components of the rhetorical situation. For instance, if that journalist is from the Weather Channel, they're probably just going to collect data and retell what happened in the tornado. However, if that journalist is a member of the community, they might lean towards telling the stories of those most impacted. In this way, the different components of the rhetorical situation can refine and shape the purpose. However, the exigence doesn't change. The tornado is what made the story worth telling. Let's think about this in terms of Greta's speech. If the purpose or desired effect was to persuade leaders to take immediate action against climate change, what was the exigence? Now remember, exigence can be an event, but it can also be an experience, an observation. Exigence is whatever moved the writer to speak. Write your answer in your notes and explain. Once a speaker defines their purpose, they need to consider the audience. While we'll discuss how they appeal to audience in another video, we'll start with the basics here, defining who that audience is. And there are two audiences to consider. First, there's the direct audience, or those who will be immediately receiving the message. As pictured here, that's like a small audience listening to a speaker. The audience members are literally, in this case, the direct audience. An indirect audience, as shown in the second picture, or a secondary audience, are those who might hear the message from others or who will receive the message indirectly. People reading an article in the newspaper about the speech, or even someone hearing about it from someone who was there. An effective speaker is going to make sure that they consider both the people that they are talking to immediately, or that direct audience, as well as the people who might consume that information later on. So let's consider the Thunberg speech again. We've established that the direct audience is the United Nations delegates and representatives. Who might be the indirect audience of this speech? In other words, who might not be sitting in the room with her, but who would hear it, care about it, think about it, and learn about it later on? Let's talk about our next component of the rhetorical situation, context. Think about the expression taking things out of context. What does that mean? Essentially, it means that you're considering a message without knowing all the information, without knowing all the necessary information. That's why context is an essential part when considering your rhetorical situation. It's information, things happening before, after, or around an event that need to be addressed or acknowledged. Consider this scenario. You have to give a speech at the school board meeting about school uniforms. An immediate piece of context, meaning context that is immediately relevant, is that a fight occurred at the school the week before when one student made fun of another's outfit. Were you to go into this meeting and completely ignore that that happened, you'd be ignoring a huge part of the rhetorical situation and probably missing an opportunity to make a connection with your audience. The broader context is still context, or those things that surround an event, but more so in the big picture and the long term. So for example, talking about a fear of conformity, talking about limiting student creativity and student individuality. Those are examples of how I could take this same scenario, talking about school uniforms, and connect it to a bigger societal, broader context. Being able to do both will give you a rich understanding of the rhetorical situation that can add to the sophistication of your writing, but also give you a better understanding of the passages that you read on your exam. So let's talk about context in Thunberg's speech. I've identified two pieces of immediate context that will give you a better understanding of the passage. The first one says, the United Nations discussed reforms to combat climate change. We know that this is the case because in her speech, Thunberg kind of implies that they aren't doing enough. She talks about empty words. She talks about the conversations and what she's been hearing at the summit already, and that it's disappointing. Knowing that they had been talking about that helped me to have that deeper understanding of Greta's feelings and concerns. Another piece of immediate context is that shortly before this, Thunberg had gone on essentially a boycott of school for a short time in which she refused to go to school until there was reform in climate change. The reason I mention this is because in the speech, she talks about the fact that she shouldn't be there, that it shouldn't be up to children to show adults how to do it. So that is a piece of context that also helps me further understand the passage. Now, in your notes, take a second and see if you can identify that broader context. What is the big picture, the so what, and the societal issue? So there's your overview of the components of the rhetorical situation. As you read passages for your AP exam, consider all of these components and how they're interacting. But we're not done yet. While part of your exam is considering the rhetorical situations of other writers, you also have to assess and engage in situations of your own in the written part of the exam. There are 3 different free response questions or essay questions on your exam. Questions 1 and 3 are persuasive in nature, while question 2, the rhetorical analysis, is more analytic. In most contexts, all of these different components of the rhetorical situation are crucial when writing effectively. Now, when you sit down for your free response question, a couple of these components won't mean quite as much. In this scenario, the exigence is pretty simple. You're being prompted to write, so you write. Personally, you might want to get credit for the course or a certain score, but those don't really hold much weight in this rhetorical situation. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about exigence when writing your free response question. Let's consider what's left. High scoring writers or sophisticated writers really consider their rhetorical situation and have a deep understanding of it. While question 2 will ask you to analyze the rhetorical situation of someone else, the author of the passage, the 2 persuasive prompts, question 1 and 3, rely on your understanding of your own unique rhetorical situation. Listed are some questions to help you consider those 2 types of prompt. First, consider what experience, knowledge, or observation you, as the speaker, can bring to this topic. While question 1, the synthesis, might provide you sources, it doesn't mean you can't bring in additional personal experience. It also helps to consider your own biases, your own feelings about a topic, because those are what are going to make your writing unique. For purpose, make sure you understand the task. Identify the task statement to determine what argument you must make. There is nothing worse as an AP reader than reading an essay of someone who just simply didn't get the question right. And so it's really important that you know your purpose in writing the essay, and that carries out throughout the entire thing. For audience, consider the requirements. Your readers will have expectations based on the rubric. Be sure to review them carefully as they'll be listed with your prompt as well. Context, we're going to talk about on the next page. But similar to purpose, make sure you identify the topic you are meant to be discussing. Reach for that sophistication component and consider, why does this topic matter, or the broader context. So let's dig into context a little bit. One way to get the sophistication point on your free response questions is to acknowledge the broader context, the so what. Now, sometimes this can be hard to identify if it's something you're not familiar with. So I have another acronym for you, a way to think about your topic to see if there's any different perspective, different angle, or a different lens that you can take when thinking about it. I use PEEPS, PEEPS, as an acronym for the different perspectives or contextual lenses that can be used to really understand an issue. First of all, let's start with pragmatic, or thinking about something logically. Is it possible? What is impossible? What obstacles exist? For example, if I were writing about school uniforms, I might ask, how would they plan to provide those uniforms? By thinking about issues pragmatically, I'm thinking about all of those logistics and functional issues that need to be considered when making a decision or coming to a stance on a given topic. An economic context is pretty straightforward. What is the bottom line? What will be the economic impact? How does expense create barriers? These are all questions that I can be asking in my head when I see the topic and the prompt, to be creating a wider understanding of the different perspectives that exist. The ethical perspective asks what is considered right and wrong. Is it right to pursue change? What moral implications exist? Does a right versus wrong even exist currently? Again, what I'm trying to do in this broader context is create a more complex understanding of the topic or the issue, and looking at it ethically is a great way to broaden that context. To consider the psychological context means to consider how is it going to impact individuals? How are people affected emotionally, physically, spiritually by the issue or subject? And how might that inform my own stance on the issue or even the claims that I'm going to make to support my thesis? And finally, the sociological context asks how it's going to affect society as a whole. How will it affect large groups of people? What's going to be the result? The point of picking out the broader context is not just to get the sophistication point on your essay, but it's really to open and broaden your mind so that you're thinking about things critically. You're not just jumping to your first stance and going from there. You're considering how would other people feel about this topic? What other angles might exist? What that does is it creates a more nuanced argument and, like I said, makes it sophisticated. Being an effective reader and writer means that you are consistently identifying and analyzing all components of the rhetorical situation and how they interact. Good writers and good readers do this naturally, but we're just getting started. Over the course of the year, we will keep practicing our ability to be picking these things out in any given text. Ultimately, the goal of this is that you will be an effective and skilled reader as well as writer by the time your AP exam comes around. Okay, believe it or not, that was the condensed version. Let's do a few review questions in your notes to wrap things up.